Welcome to class, everyone. Let's just jump right into today's explainer. Now, when we usually think about the founding of America, it's super easy to fall back on that classic mythology, right? A totally unified, liberty-loving group of colonists standing shoulder to shoulder against this evil, tyrannical empire. But as a historian, I've got to tell you, the reality was way more complex, and honestly, a whole lot more fascinating. Today, we're going to totally challenge that whole good versus evil narrative. We're pulling back the curtain on a deeply divided society to show you how the American Revolution wasn't just some clean rebellion against Britain. It was actually a bitter, highly fractured, internal civil war. So here's our syllabus for today's lecture. First, we'll look at a fractured American empire. Then, the anatomy of a loyalist. Third, the intense pressure from patriot committees. Fourth, the actual shift to independence. And finally, the empire strikes back. Let's get to it. Starting off with Section 1 of Fractured American Empire. Okay, picture this. It's the autumn of 1775. Patriot forces actually control a lot of the 13 colonies, but they decide, hey, we need to strike Canada, mostly to stop the British from using it as a staging ground. So in September, General Richard Montgomery sieges Fort St. John to open up the road north. Meanwhile, you've got Colonel Benedict Arnold making this absolutely brutal, treacherous march through the freezing wilderness to meet up with him. But man, by December, under the cover of a massive blizzard, their combined assault on Quebec it's a total disaster. Montgomery is killed, Arnold is badly wounded, and what's left of the Patriot Army is just freezing and getting totally ravaged by smallpox. Bad news. But hey, down in Massachusetts, completely different story. January 1776, this 25-year-old bookseller named Henry Knox pulls off a mind-blowing logistical miracle. He literally drags 59 heavy guns weighing tons across 300 miles of snow and ice from Fort Ticonderoga all the way to Boston. By March, George Washington takes those guns and brilliantly fortifies Dorchester Heights overnight. The British wake up, see these cannons, realize there's a hurricane-strength storm brewing, and they just evacuate Boston entirely. So you see this massive contrast, right? A catastrophic defeat up north and this huge tactical triumph in Boston. It sets this incredibly tense, really high-stakes backdrop back home. Moving on to Section 2, Anatomy of a Loyalist. Now, you might think everyone cheered when news of Washington's victory in Boston hit, right? Well, actually, no. Roughly 20%, that is 1 in 5 colonists, stayed totally loyal to the British crown. This completely shatters that popular misconception that everyone was united for independence. No way. A really significant chunk of the population actively opposed the rebellion. They actually saw these patriot leaders as dangerous, ill-designing men trying to ruin everything. So, who exactly were these loyalists? Well, their allegiance wasn't just blind obedience to the king. It was deeply rooted in their principles and their everyday lives. First up, we've got recent immigrants. A lot of these folks had vital social and economic ties back in Britain. They didn't want to just sever their livelihoods overnight. Then you've got the Anglicans. For them, loyalty was literally a religious requirement. King George III was the head of the Church of England, so going against him meant going against the church. And finally, the conservatives. This group looked back at history and were genuinely terrified that an American republic would just dissolve into complete anarchy and unchecked mob rule. And that conservative fear, it is perfectly captured by this honestly haunting historical question from the time. Which is better, to be ruled by one tyrant 3,000 miles away, or by 3,000 tyrants not a mile away? Wow. I mean, think about that. This wasn't some abstract philosophical debate for these people. They were terrified of the horrors of armed conflict. They predicted their, once happy land would be plunged into a ruthless war with torrents of blood spilled. To them, local mob rule was way more terrifying than some distant imperial taxation. Which brings us to Section 3, Pressure from Patriot Committees. Let's walk through how all this social pressure escalated, because it is terrifying. A lot of colonists probably just wanted to sit this whole thing out, but the Patriots, they made that practically impossible. Step 1. Without royal authority around, these local Patriot Committees of Inspection and Safety just sprang up out of nowhere and took over local government duties. Step 2. By 1776, if you were even suspected of being a loyalist sympathizer, you were closely monitored and investigated by these committees. It was like living in a surveillance state. Step 3. Things get violent fast. Suspects were targeted, they were harassed, and actively oppressed by rowdy patriot mobs. And then Step 4. This violence gets so intense that countless loyalists were literally driven out of their homes and parishes. They had to flee into exile just to escape imprisonment or, in some cases, immediate death. So the main takeaway here is that this was a profoundly personal tragedy. This conflict divided entire communities, tore families apart, pitching neighbor against neighbor and literally father against son. We even see loyalists forming their own militia companies to fight patriot partisans for years. Understanding this totally shifts how we look at the founding of the nation. It wasn't this peaceful, unified march toward liberty. It was an intimate, highly fractured, and brutal civil war. Let's turn to Section 4, the shift to independence. Watching this ideological clash happen in real time is just incredible. By April 1776, the calls to totally separate from Britain are getting super loud. And a lot of that is fueled by a brand new pamphlet called Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, a British radical living in Philly. Paine writes in plain, everyday English. He totally mocks the whole idea of a monarchy, saying, "Of more worth is one honest man to society than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived." Boom. But now, juxtapose that with the reaction from a loyalist named Nicholas Creswell. He called Paine's pamphlet one of the vilest things that was ever published, full of false representations, lies, calumny, and treason. But here is the real game changer. Patriots controlled the printing presses, so an estimated 100,000 copies of Common Sense were printed and sold. It spread like wildfire, convincing thousands of ordinary folks that independence was literally the only way forward. All this ideological momentum finally hits a boiling point in Philadelphia. In June 1776, the Continental Congress is meeting every single day for these incredibly heated, tense debates. They knew they absolutely needed unanimous consent for this to work, so you have all these down-to-the-wire backroom deals and major last-minute U-turns. Finally, on July 2nd, Congress officially votes in favor of independence. Then, 2 days later, on July 4th, they formally adopt the written Declaration of Independence, drafted by heavyweights. You know them: Adams, Jefferson, Franklin. Now, a fun fact historians love to point out, this super revolutionary document, it was ironically modeled straight out of English precedents, like the 1689 Declaration of Rights and Bill of Rights. And they were making revisions up to the very last second, like scratching out a whole paragraph criticizing the slave trade just to appease the southern colonies. In the end, all 56 delegates signed it. They literally pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. No turning back now. And that brings us to this wildly specific number on the screen, 42,088. Right after the declaration, massive celebrations and demonstrations just erupt across the newly named United States. Up in New York, a rowdy crowd topples this huge 15-foot lead statue of King George III. And what do they do with it? They melt it down into exactly 42,088 musket bullets for the Continental Army. I mean, talk about symbolism. It perfectly illustrates this violent point of no return. They were independent states now, at least on paper, and they were quite literally weaponizing the image of their former king to defend that claim. Finally, Section 5, the Empire Strikes Back. 32,000. Look, in the summer of 1776, George Washington is waiting anxiously in New York. And suddenly, sails start appearing on the horizon. Dozens at first, then over 100. General Howe arrives, and he is soon joined by a massive fleet from England, commanded by his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. So you have a total of 32,000 British soldiers, 12,000 sailors, and 400 ships, all converging on New York. To put that insane scale into perspective, this armada represented almost half the military might of the entire British Empire. And the craziest part? They landed unopposed on Staten Island, actively cheered on by the local loyalist population. Which leaves us with this final, honestly chilling question. As those Royal Navy frigates sail right up the Hudson River, bombarding Manhattan with absolute impunity, you've got to ask, how on earth will a newly minted, deeply divided United States survive the full, unrestrained wrath of the British Empire? We've seen today that they aren't just taking on a global superpower, they're actively fighting their own neighbors in a bitter civil war. The odds are terrifying, their society is totally fractured, and the ultimate imperial fleet is now sitting right in their harbor. Think about that the next time you picture the founding of America. All right, class, dismissed. I will see you next time as we keep diving into the fascinating realities of history.